The darkness of space held many secrets, and the Valorian collective believed they knew them all. For 3 long years, their observation ships had hidden behind Neptune, watching the small blue world called Earth with great interest and careful study, recording every signal and scanning every vessel that moved through the human solar system, building a complete picture of this new species they had discovered at the edge of explored space. Ambassador Thalvax stood at the viewing port of his diplomatic cruiser, his crystalline body catching the dim light of distant stars and breaking it into 1,000 tiny rainbows across the walls of his private chamber. And he felt nothing but confidence as he reviewed the data on humanity for the 100th time. 7 centuries of diplomatic victories had taught him everything he needed to know about conquering species through words instead of weapons. And humanity seemed like the easiest target he had ever encountered in his long and distinguished career. Their bodies were soft and fragile, made of weak flesh that could be torn and broken with minimal effort. And they lived such short lives that most humans would die of old age before a Valorian even reached middle years. Their technology was primitive by galactic standards, with faster-than-light drives that were slow and inefficient, weapons that seemed almost childish compared to collective armaments, and shields that any competent Valorian gunner could break through in seconds. They had barely spread beyond their home system, colonizing only a dozen worlds in the century since they had developed space travel, and their military fleet was small and scattered across their tiny territory. "What a simple conquest this will be," Thalvax said to his assistant, a young Valorian named Crix, who had never witnessed a species integration before and was eager to learn from the master. "How long do you estimate the negotiations will take, Ambassador?" Crix asked with genuine curiosity. "A single generation at most," Thalvax replied with absolute certainty. "And perhaps much less if they prove as agreeable as the initial data suggests they will be." The collective had absorbed 400 species across the galactic arm using this same method, approaching new civilizations with offers of trade and technology, slowly binding them with economic agreements and cultural integration protocols, until they had no choice but to accept full absorption into the collective, or face the implicit threat of the massive armadas that waited in the shadows. No species had ever chosen to fight, because no species had ever been foolish enough to believe they could win against the greatest military force the galaxy had ever known. First contact with humanity occurred in orbit above Mars, where a human space station floated in the red planet's thin atmosphere and served as a hub for their colonial traffic. The humans sent diplomats to meet with Thalvax, and he was surprised by how pleasant they seemed, with their soft voices and easy smiles and willingness to discuss terms without any of the posturing and threatening that other species usually attempted in the early stages of negotiation. A woman named Admiral Chen Wei-Lin led the human delegation, and Thalvax found it curious that they had sent a military officer to conduct peace talks. But he dismissed this detail as simply a quirk of human culture. "We are honored to meet representatives of the Valorian collective," Admiral Chun said through the translation device, her voice calm and her expression friendly. "And we look forward to establishing a beneficial relationship between our peoples. The collective extends its welcome to humanity," Thalvax responded with practiced diplomatic grace. "And we are confident that your species will find great prosperity within our union." The negotiations proceeded faster than Thalvax had anticipated, with the humans agreeing to nearly every term he proposed without significant resistance. Trade agreements were signed that would give the collective access to human resources and labor. Technology exchange protocols were established that would slowly make humanity dependent on Valorian systems. And cultural integration programs were approved that would begin reshaping human society to match collective standards. Admiral Chun smiled and nodded and signed document after document, and Thalvax grew more confident with each passing day that this would be his easiest conquest yet. He transmitted regular reports to the collective High Council, assuring them that humanity posed no threat and would be fully absorbed within a generation without any need for military intervention. "They are agreeable," he wrote in his final assessment, "almost disappointingly so. And I predict complete integration within 20 years at the current rate of progress." The High Council was pleased with this news, and they authorized the next phase of the operation. The integration fleet began assembling at the edge of the Sol system, gathering in the darkness beyond the range of human sensors, growing larger day by day as more warships arrived from across collective space. 12,000 vessels eventually filled the void, representing enough firepower to crack planets and burn entire civilizations to ash. A force so massive that no species in galactic history had ever been able to stand against it. This was standard protocol for what the collective called the final negotiation phase, where the implicit threat of military force became explicit, and the target species was given one last chance to accept full absorption before the alternative was demonstrated in the most brutal possible terms. No species had ever resisted at this stage, because no species had ever looked upon the integration fleet and believed survival was possible. Thalvex watched the human diplomats carefully during the final weeks of negotiation, searching for any sign that they knew what was coming. But Admiral Chun and her team seemed completely unaware of the doom that gathered in the darkness of their system. They continued to smile and nod and discuss minor points of treaty language as if they had all the time in the universe, and Thalvex felt almost sorry for them in their ignorance. Such a primitive species, he mused to Crix one evening after the humans had departed for the day. They have no idea what is about to happen to them. Should we warn them, Ambassador? Crix asked with what might have been sympathy. That would defeat the purpose, Thalvex replied with a cold smile. The shock of seeing the fleet is part of the process, and it helps ensure quick compliance when they realize resistance is impossible. He turned back to the viewing port and gazed out at the stars, imagining the 12,000 warships that waited just beyond human detection range. Soon humanity would learn the truth about the Valorian collective, and soon they would kneel like every other species before them. The ambassador had no doubts about this outcome, because he had seen it happen 400 times before, and he could not imagine any reason why this conquest would be different from all the others. He could not have been more wrong. 6 months had passed since first contact, and Ambassador Thalvex believed victory was close enough to taste. The integration treaty sat on the table before him, a thick document containing thousands of provisions that would bind humanity to the collective forever. And all that remained was for Admiral Chun to sign the final page and seal her species' fate. But when the human delegation arrived for what Thalvex expected to be the last negotiation session, something in the air felt different, a tension that had not been present in any of their previous meetings. Admiral Chun walked into the conference room with her usual calm expression, but her eyes held a sharpness that the ambassador had not noticed before, and she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. "Ambassador Thalvex," she said as she took her seat across from him. "Before we proceed with the final signing, humanity wishes to request one small amendment to the treaty." Thalvex felt a flicker of annoyance, because last-minute changes were always tedious to process. But he forced himself to maintain his diplomatic smile. "Of course, Admiral," he replied smoothly. "What modification does humanity wish to propose?" "We wish to retain full sovereignty over our core worlds," Admiral Chun said, without any hesitation, "including Earth, Mars, and our 12 established colonies." The ambassador's crystalline body made a soft cracking sound as stress fractures formed across his chest, a physical manifestation of his sudden anger that he quickly struggled to control. This request was not unexpected, because every species made some version of it during the final stages of negotiation, grasping desperately for any scrap of independence they could maintain before surrendering to the inevitable. "I am afraid that is not possible," Thalvex said with practiced patience. "Full integration requires complete absorption of all territories, and there can be no exceptions to this requirement." He waited for Admiral Chun to argue, to plead, to offer alternative compromises that he would reject one by one until she finally accepted defeat. That was how this dance always went, and Thalvex had performed it hundreds of times with hundreds of species. But Admiral Chun did not argue. She simply nodded once, as if she had expected exactly this response, and then she stood from her chair and began gathering her documents. "Then we have nothing further to discuss," she said, in a voice that held no anger or fear or desperation, only a calm certainty that chilled Thalvex to his crystal core. "What do you mean?" the ambassador demanded, rising from his own seat in confusion. "I mean that negotiations are concluded," Admiral Chun replied as she walked toward the door. "Humanity thanks the collective for its time, and we wish you safe travels on your journey home." The door closed behind her, and Thalvex stood alone in the conference room, unable to process what had just happened. In 400 conquests across 7 centuries of diplomatic service, no species had ever simply walked away from the negotiating table. They begged and pleaded and threatened and bargained, but they always stayed, because they knew that leaving meant facing the alternative. But humanity had left as if they did not care about the alternative, as if 12,000 warships posed no threat worth considering. Thalvex contacted the integration fleet immediately, ordering the forward elements to begin their approach toward human space, confident that a show of force would bring the humans back to the table within hours. But hours passed, and humanity remained silent. Their colonies dimmed their communication signals until they were barely detectable. Their merchant vessels withdrew from all shipping lanes, and their diplomatic channels went completely dark. Even more disturbing were the reports from collective surveillance drones stationed throughout human territory. One by one, the drones began disappearing, vanishing without distress signals or debris or any indication of what had destroyed them. Thalvex ordered more drones sent to investigate, and those disappeared as well. He tried to contact Admiral Chun through emergency channels, but received no response. He attempted to reach any human authority who would speak with him, but every transmission went unanswered. The silence was absolute, and it was terrifying. For the first time in his 7 centuries of life, Ambassador Thalvex experienced an emotion his species had nearly forgotten how to feel. A cold, creeping sensation that spread through his crystalline body like frost across glass. He was afraid. The High Council grew impatient with the lack of progress and demanded that Thalvex resolve the situation immediately, threatening to replace him with a less gentle diplomat if he could not bring humanity back to the negotiating table. Perhaps they simply need a demonstration, Fleet Admiral Zexthel suggested during their emergency communication. A reminder of what happens to species who refuse collective generosity. Thalvex agreed reluctantly, because he could think of no other option that might break humanity's stubborn silence. The Fleet Admiral dispatched a forward assault group of 500 warships, a force large enough to destroy most species entirely, and ordered them to proceed to Earth and secure the human homeworld by any means necessary. Take their leaders captive, if possible, Zexthel commanded, but destroy anyone who resists, and make an example that will encourage quick compliance. The assault group jumped to hyperspace, their crews confident that they were embarking on an easy mission against primitive opponents who had no hope of meaningful resistance. Fleet Commander Yixoth led the formation from his flagship, the massive dreadnought Eternal Victory, and he felt nothing but contempt for the humans he was about to conquer. This campaign will last 3 days at most, he announced to his officers. "And then we will celebrate our easy victory." His officers cheered and prepared their weapons, eager to prove their worth against another helpless species. None of them suspected that they were flying toward the worst defeat in collective military history. None of them knew that something was waiting for them in the darkness between stars. And none of them could have imagined that 500 warships would not be enough, because they were about to encounter something the collective had never faced before. They were about to meet a human warship. Ambassador Thalvex remained at his post near Mars, waiting for reports of human surrender that would never come, still believing that everything would proceed according to plan. He spent his hours reviewing human cultural archives, searching for anything that might explain their strange behavior, but finding nothing that suggested they posed any real threat. He would soon learn how wrong he had been. He would soon learn that humanity had been hiding something from the collective since the very first day of negotiations. And he would learn that some secrets were worth dying for, while others were worth killing for. The humans, it seemed, had both kinds. The assault group emerged from hyperspace in a flash of twisted light and displaced energy. 500 warships, materializing in perfect formation above the asteroid belt that marked the boundary of human core territory. Fleet Commander Yixoth stood at the center of his bridge, his scaled body radiating confidence as sensor officers reported their findings. And he expected to see human defense stations and patrol craft scrambling to respond to his overwhelming force. Instead, his sensors showed only one contact. "Report," Yixoth demanded, confusion evident in his voice. "One vessel, Commander," the sensor officer replied, her tone equally confused. "Approximately 2 kilometers in length, angular hull design. Currently stationary at coordinates directly ahead of our formation." Yixoth moved to the main display and examined the image of the human ship, searching for any sign that it was part of a larger fleet hidden behind sensor screens or stealth technology. But there was nothing except empty space and distant stars. The human vessel sat alone in the void, its dark hull absorbing light rather than reflecting it, making it appear as a shadow cut from the fabric of space itself. It broadcast no signals and made no attempt at communication, showing no fear or urgency despite facing 500 enemy warships. It simply waited, patient and silent, like a predator watching prey approach. "Perhaps it is a decoy," one of his officers suggested, "meant to distract us while their real fleet attacks from another direction." Yixoth considered this possibility but rejected it, because human sensor technology was too primitive to hide a meaningful fleet from collective scanners. "Contact the vessel," he ordered. "Demand their immediate surrender or face destruction." The communications officer transmitted the ultimatum on all frequencies. In every language the collective had recorded from human broadcasts, but the dark ship gave no response. Seconds passed, then minutes, and still the human vessel remained silent and motionless. "They must be paralyzed with fear," Yixoth concluded with a cruel laugh. "One small ship against 500, and they know they cannot escape. So they wait for death like the primitives they are." He raised his arm and prepared to give the order that would begin humanity's destruction. "Forward destroyers," he commanded. "Eliminate that vessel." 17 collective warships broke formation and accelerated toward the lone human ship, their weapons charging with enough energy to vaporize a small moon. Targeting systems locked onto the dark hull, and gunners prepared to fire the first shots of what they expected to be a quick and easy conquest. The destroyers opened fire. Beams of concentrated plasma and bolts of antimatter screamed across the void toward the human vessel, a storm of destruction that would have overwhelmed any ship the collective had ever encountered. But the human ship was not like any vessel the collective had ever encountered. It moved. The words seemed inadequate to describe what actually happened, because the ship did not simply dodge or evade. It flowed through space like water through fingers, sliding between energy beams as if it knew exactly where they would be before they were fired. Yixoth watched in disbelief as the human vessel danced through the combined firepower of 17 destroyers, every shot missing by the smallest possible margin. And then the ship accelerated toward his fleet with impossible speed. It closed the distance in seconds, moving faster than any vessel its size should be able to move, and then it began to attack. The first collective destroyer exploded without warning, its hull torn apart by projectiles moving at a significant fraction of light speed. The second destroyer followed moments later, its reactor breached by some kind of energy weapon that bypassed shields entirely. The third and fourth destroyers died together, caught in a web of missiles that fragmented into thousands of smaller munitions, each one seeking a target with terrible precision. Yixoth could not believe what his eyes were showing him. In less than 11 minutes, 43 of his warships had been reduced to expanding clouds of debris and cooling plasma. All ships full assault. He screamed into the fleet channel. Destroy that thing immediately. 457 collective warships unleashed everything they had at the human vessel, a concentration of firepower that could have cracked a planet's crust and boiled its oceans to steam. This time, the human ship did not evade. It flew straight into the storm of weapons fire, and Yixoth felt a surge of triumph, believing the enemy had finally made a fatal mistake. But the first plasma beams struck the dark hull, and something incredible happened. Golden light flickered across the surface of the human ship, a shimmering barrier that absorbed energy and dissipated it harmlessly into space. Antimatter bolts detonated against the golden shield and accomplished nothing. Missile barrages exploded in brilliant flowers of destruction that left the human vessel completely unharmed. The combined firepower of an entire fleet, enough to devastate civilizations, was being shrugged off by a single ship as if it were nothing more than rain against a mountain. And then the human ship spoke. A voice emerged from every speaker on every collective vessel, calm and almost gentle, carrying no anger or hatred, only quiet confidence. "I am the UN's Thermopylae," the voice said. "I am the guardian of Sol, and you will advance no further." The battle that followed lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of desperate fighting as collective warships tried everything they could imagine to destroy or disable the human vessel. 6 hours of watching their comrades die by the dozens, torn apart by weapons they could not defend against. 6 hours of growing horror as they realized they were not fighting a battle, they were being hunted. The Thermopylae moved through the collective formation like a wolf among sheep, striking and withdrawing, appearing where it was least expected and vanishing before counterattacks could be organized. Its weapons never seemed to run dry, its shields never seemed to weaken, and its crew never seemed to tire or make mistakes. When the sun rose over distant Earth to mark the end of those terrible 6 hours, Fleet Commander Yixoth looked at his tactical display and felt his soul collapse into despair. Of the 500 warships that had entered human space with dreams of easy conquest, only 11 remained. 11 battered, broken vessels with damaged engines and wounded crews, fleeing toward the hyperspace boundary with every scrap of speed they could manage. Yixoth was not among the survivors. His flagship, the Eternal Victory, had been destroyed in the 4th hour of battle, torn in half by a single relativistic projectile that killed 2,000 crew members in less than a second. The 11 survivors broadcast desperate warnings as they fled, transmitting recordings of the battle and descriptions of the terrible ship that had destroyed their fleet. And behind them, hanging alone in a field of molten wreckage, the UN's Thermopylae waited in patient silence. It had done what it was designed to do. It had guarded the gate, and the enemy had not passed. Now it waited for repairs, and wondered if the collective would be foolish enough to try again. It almost hoped they would. Ambassador Thalvex received a transmission from the 11 survivors and felt his crystalline body crack from stress. He watched the battle recordings in stunned silence, witnessing the impossible destruction of 500 collective warships by a single human vessel. And his mind struggled to accept what his eyes were clearly showing him. This could not be happening. This had never happened in the entire history of the collective. 400 species had been absorbed without meaningful military resistance, because no species had ever possessed the capability to resist collective military might. But the recordings did not lie, and the survivors were still transmitting their desperate warnings as they limped towards safety. Thalvex watched the final moments of the eternal victory, seeing the flagship split apart like a piece of rotten fruit, and he felt a terror unlike anything he had experienced in 7 centuries of life. How had the humans done this? How had they hidden such power during 6 months of negotiations? Why had they pretended to be weak when they possessed weapons that could destroy fleets? The ambassador needed answers, and he knew only one place to find them. He accessed the human cultural archives that they had freely shared during negotiations, information about their history and biology and society that Thalvex had reviewed before but never truly studied. He had been looking for weaknesses to exploit, vulnerabilities that would make conquest easier, and he had found many things that seemed to confirm humanity's inferiority. But now he began to read with different eyes, searching for the truth he had missed, and what he found made his crystalline soul tremble with dawning horror. Earth was not a paradise world like the collective homeworld. Earth was a death world. The humans had evolved on a planet that seemed designed to kill everything that lived on it. A world of extreme temperatures and violent weather and toxic atmospheres and predators that hunted in every environment. Ice ages had frozen their ancestors nearly to extinction, and then heat waves had baked the survivors in merciless summers. Plagues had swept across their populations again and again, killing millions and leaving the survivors stronger and more resistant. And throughout all of this, humans had fought each other with savage intensity. Thalvex found records of human wars stretching back thousands of years, conflicts that killed millions and destroyed entire civilizations. Battles fought with weapons that grew more terrible with each generation. They had developed chemical weapons that melted flesh and biological weapons that spread unstoppable diseases and nuclear weapons that could vaporize cities in a single flash. And still, they had survived. Still, they had grown stronger. Still, they had reached for the stars with the same determination that had carried them through ice ages and plagues and wars. The collective had evolved on a world with no predators and no competitors, where resources were abundant and conflict was unnecessary. They had developed their military might through slow theoretical progress over millions of years, building weapons that were powerful but had never truly been tested in real combat. Humans had been fighting for their entire existence. Every weapon system they possessed had been refined in the fires of actual warfare, tested against enemies who were trying just as hard to kill them. Every tactic and doctrine and strategy came from lessons written in blood across thousands of battlefields. They had not shown the collective their true capabilities because the collective had not asked. They had been polite. They had been diplomatic. They had smiled and nodded and signed agreements, while keeping their real power hidden behind a mask of apparent weakness. Thalvex found a human concept called deterrence that explained their strategy perfectly. Humans did not display their full strength during negotiations, because doing so would eliminate the possibility of peaceful resolution. They kept their true power in reserve, revealed only when necessary, as a final warning to enemies who refused to see reason. The Thermopylae had been that warning. And now Thalvex understood the most terrifying truth of all. He searched through the human military archives, looking for information about the ship that had destroyed 500 collective warships, and what he found made him want to weep. The UN's Thermopylae was not humanity's greatest warship. It was not even close to their greatest warship. It was classified as a border patrol vessel, one of hundreds assigned to routine guard duty throughout human space. It was designed for extended solo operations, built to hold defensive positions until reinforcements could arrive. Equipped with enough firepower to discourage minor threats but not intended for major fleet engagements. And it had destroyed 500 collective warships without apparent effort. If this was what a minor human vessel could do, what could their major warships accomplish? If a single patrol ship could defeat an assault group, what could an entire human fleet achieve? Thalvex pulled up Earth's military registry, public information that had been available since the first day of negotiations, data that he had simply never bothered to examine carefully. He looked at the numbers and felt cracks spreading across his entire body. The United Nations Space Command maintained over 12,000 combat vessels, organized into dozens of fleets stationed throughout human territory. Their largest ships were 10 times the size of the Thermopylae, with proportionally greater firepower and defensive capabilities. Their smallest attack craft were designed to operate in swarms of thousands, overwhelming enemies with sheer numbers. And this was only their known military strength. Human history showed that they often maintained secret weapons and hidden fleets, revealed only when enemies forced them into open warfare. The integration fleet sat at the edge of human space with 12,000 warships, believing itself to be an unstoppable force that no species could resist. But if one human patrol ship could destroy 500 collective vessels, then 12,000 human warships could destroy. Thalvex could not complete the calculation. His mind refused to process numbers so catastrophic. He sat in his quarters for hours, staring at the data that proved everything he had believed was wrong. The collective had not found an easy conquest. They had stumbled upon a species more dangerous than anything they had ever encountered. They had mistaken kindness for weakness and diplomacy for submission. And now they stood at the edge of a war they could not possibly win. The ambassador knew he needed to contact the High Council immediately. He needed to warn them about the terrible mistake they had made. He needed to convince them to withdraw before humanity decided that the collective was too dangerous to leave alive. Because Thalvex now understood something that filled him with existential dread. The humans had been holding back. They had been giving the collective every opportunity to choose peace. And if the collective refused that opportunity, the humans would demonstrate exactly why their species had survived a death world while so many others had perished. Thalvex began composing the most important message of his 700-year career. He only hoped it would not be too late. High Admiral Zexthale of the Integration Fleet received Ambassador Thalvex's report and refused to believe it. He demanded confirmation, then demanded it again when confirmation was provided, and then demanded the original battle recordings because he could not accept that written reports were telling the truth. He watched the recordings 17 times, seeing his warships torn apart by a single human vessel, and each viewing made the reality harder to deny. 500 ships lost. Nearly 100,000 crew members dead. All because of one small patrol craft that should not have been able to scratch the paint on a collective destroyer. Zexthal gathered his senior commanders and showed them the recordings, hoping one of them would find an explanation that made sense. But they watched in the same stunned silence that had gripped the ambassador, and none of them could offer any comfort. It must be a trick, one admiral suggested weakly. Some kind of illusion or electronic deception designed to frighten us into retreat. The survivors saw it with their own eyes. Another replied, and their damaged ships are proof that the battle was real. Then we attack with the full fleet, a third commander declared. 12,000 ships against one, and we will overwhelm whatever defenses they possess. But Zexthal had studied Ambassador Thalvex's data on humanity. and he knew that one ship was not the extent of human power. He shared the information about human military strength, the 12,000 warships they maintained, the hidden fleets they might possess, and the terrible efficiency of their weapons compared to collective armaments. The mathematics were devastating. If one human patrol ship could destroy 500 collective vessels, what could 12,000 human warships achieve against the integration fleet? The answer was obvious, and it silenced every voice in the command chamber. Zexthal ordered the integration fleet to hold position at the edge of human space, advancing no further until he could determine the correct course of action. 3 days passed with the greatest armada the collective had ever assembled sitting motionless in the void. 3 days of nervous waiting while officers and crew wondered what would happen next. 3 days of staring at sensor screens and waiting for human warships to appear and finish what the Thermopylae had started. And then, on the 4th day, the humans made contact. A communication request arrived on collective frequencies, using proper diplomatic protocols, and Zexthal accepted it with trembling hands. He expected to see Admiral Chun, the woman who had led negotiations before the breakdown. Instead, a young human appeared on his screen, wearing a junior officer's uniform and smiling politely. "The United Nations Space Command acknowledges your presence at our border," the young woman said in a friendly tone. "We assume you received our message." Zexthal found his voice failing him, because this was not how conquered species were supposed to behave. "What message?" he managed to ask. "The Thermopylae," the human replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the universe. Silence filled the command chamber. The human continued without waiting for a response, maintaining her pleasant expression throughout. "We are prepared to resume diplomatic talks," she said. "Admiral Chun is available at your convenience. And she asked me to inform you that humanity remains interested in peaceful cooperation and trade." She paused for a moment, and something shifted in her eyes, something that reminded Zexthal of predators he had seen in nature documentaries. "She also wanted you to know that we have positioned the Thermopylae for repairs at Jupiter Station," the young officer continued. "It performed well, but our engineers want to upgrade its secondary systems." The implication hung in the void between them. The ship that had destroyed 500 warships was considered to have merely performed well, and now required upgrades to make it better. "However," the human added, her smile never wavering, "if you prefer to continue your current approach, we can arrange a different kind of welcome." She let those words sink in before delivering the final blow. "The Solholm fleet has been placed on active status," she announced. "All 4,800 ships are awaiting orders." Zexthal felt his soul collapse as he processed this information. If one ship could destroy 500, then 4,800 ships could destroy. He could not complete the thought. "We will await Ambassador Chun's communication," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of defeat. The young officer nodded politely and ended the transmission. 3 months later, the Valorian Collective signed a treaty with humanity unlike any agreement in their 400 conquest history. Not a treaty of absorption or integration. Not a treaty between master and subject. A treaty between equals. Humanity would retain full sovereignty over all their worlds, now and forever, and the collective would respect their borders as they would respect any other great power. Trade and cultural exchange would proceed on terms negotiated fairly, with neither side holding power over the other. And the integration fleet would return to collective space, never to threaten human worlds again. Ambassador Thalvex was present for the signing ceremony, watching Admiral Chun place her signature on the final document, and he felt a strange mixture of shame and admiration. He approached her afterward, wanting to understand the species that had humbled his civilization. "You knew from the beginning, did you not?" he asked. "Knew what, Ambassador?" "That we could not defeat you," Thalvex replied. You knew our fleet was gathering, and you knew we intended to force your submission. Admiral Chun considered the question carefully before answering. We suspected, she admitted. Your pattern with other species was well documented, and we prepared accordingly. Then why negotiate at all? Dalvex demanded. Why not simply destroy our fleet when it arrived? Because we hoped it would not be necessary, the Admiral replied. War is expensive in lives and resources, and we would rather make friends than enemies when the choice is possible, even with species who intend to conquer you, especially with those species, Admiral Chun said with a gentle smile, because they are the ones who need to learn that there are better ways to exist in the universe. Dalvex thought about her words for a long time. Years later, a collective historian would visit Earth to study humanity and understand how such a young species had achieved such remarkable power. He secured an interview with Admiral Chun, now retired and living in a small house by the sea, and he asked her the question that had haunted the collective since the Battle of the Asteroid Belt. Why did you send only one ship to face 500? He asked. Admiral Chun sipped her tea and considered the question with the same careful thoughtfulness she had shown in every negotiation. We wanted to give you every opportunity to reconsider, she said finally. War is expensive, and diplomacy is cheaper. So we hoped that seeing what a single ship could do would be enough to convince you that peace was the better option. And if it was not enough, the historian pressed. Admiral Chun smiled the same polite diplomatic smile she had worn throughout negotiations. The same smile that had convinced Dalvex she was weak when she was actually stronger than anyone he had ever known. Then we would have sent two, she replied. The historian returned to collective space and shared this story with his people, and it became a teaching tale passed down through generations. It reminded them that strength and kindness were not opposites, that the most powerful beings could also be the most gentle, and that wisdom meant knowing when to fight and when to offer peace. The collective never forgot the lesson humanity had taught them, and they never made the mistake of confusing kindness for weakness again.